Case number 1. Anthony John Sully. In the early 1980s, the suburbs of San Francisco were gripped by a localized terror. 55-gallon industrial drums filled with wet concrete and human remains were being abandoned in the greenery of Golden Gate Park. The man behind these barrel murders wasn't a career criminal from the underworld. He was a man who knew exactly how the police would investigate him because he used to be one of them. Anthony John Sully served as a police officer for the Millbrae Police Department from 1966 to 1974. To his colleagues, he was a capable, disciplined officer. But behind the uniform, a predatory pathology was festering. During his years on the force, Sully was living a double life marked by extreme domestic violence. 2 marriages ended in divorce due to what court records called constant physical assaults. The most chilling sign of what was to come occurred after his second divorce. To terrify his ex-wife, Sully took his stepdaughter's pet ducklings and twisted their heads off. He told her plainly, "I can do the same to your daughter." This wasn't just a threat, it was a demonstration of a man who viewed life as something he had the right to extinguish. By 1983, Sully had left the force and was running an electrical contracting business. He rented a massive industrial warehouse in Burlingame. To the outside world, it was a place of business. To Sully, it was a kill zone, a soundproof, isolated fortress where he could act out his darkest impulses without interruption. Sully had traded his badge for a heavy addiction to freebase cocaine. He began bankrolling a local escort agency, using his money and his former police status to dominate a circle of vulnerable women and drug dealers. He adopted the persona of Jack, a figure who demanded total obedience. Sully's transition into serial murder was calculated. He didn't just kill, he utilized his police training to facilitate his crimes. He understood forensic limitations, fingerprinting, and the mechanics of restraint. He would later tell his accomplices that the only difference between his murders and his time as a cop was official permission. He believed his training gave him a permanent license to deal in death. Between February and August of 1983, 6 people entered Sully's warehouse and never walked out. The first was Gloria Jean Fravel, a 24-year-old who owed a debt to Sully's associates. Sully used police handcuffs to suspend her from the warehouse ceiling. For an entire weekend, he tortured and assaulted her. When she screamed for help, he used a hangman's noose in his own body weight to strangle her. When he realized she was still alive during transport, he finished the murder with a hatchet. Next was Brenda Oakton, a 19-year-old runaway. Sully wanted a victim who wasn't jaded by the street life. He shot her in the back of the head inside the warehouse. She became the first victim he encased in concrete. Then came Michael Thomas and Phyllis Melendez, a pimp and his wife who had a disagreement with Sully. He lured them to the hangar, executed them both with gunshots to the head, and stuffed them into 55-gallon drums. In August, the violence peaked. He murdered Barbara Searcy, an ex-girlfriend who came to him for financial help. He killed her for personal reasons and used his truck to mutilate her body beyond recognition to hinder identification. The final victim was Catherine Barrett, a 24-year-old drug dealer. When an accomplice failed to kill her quickly with a knife, Sully expressed disgust at the inefficiency. He took a sledgehammer and crushed her skull. Sully believed he was forensically invisible. He used his construction knowledge to mix specific batches of concrete, believing it would mask the smell of decomposition and destroy biological evidence. He dumped the barrels in Golden Gate Park, a high-profile location, to mock the authorities. He would even sit with his accomplices and read news reports about the bodies being found, reveling in the fear he created. But his arrogance was his downfall. Despite his training, Sully left behind physical markers. Investigators found his fingerprints on the outside of the drums. Even more damning, they found handprints pressed into the wet concrete inside the barrels, the literal signature of the killer and his accomplices. When police searched his Burlingame warehouse, the evidence was overwhelming. They found the yellow rope used to bind Barbara Searcy in rare plastic bags that matched the ones used to wrap the victims. The mask of sanity was stripped away. In 1986, Anthony Sully was sentenced to death. During the trial, he remained a narcissist to the end, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy and insisting he wasn't a monster. He spent the next 37 years on San Quentin's death row. Because of California's moratorium on the death penalty, the state never carried out his execution. Sully died of natural causes in a medical facility on September 8, 2023, at the age of 79. He died a lonely death, with no family to claim his body. Anthony Sully remains a terrifying example of institutional betrayal. He took the tools, the tactics, and the authority given to him by the public and used them to build a factory of death. He was a man who knew the law, which is exactly what made him so good at breaking it. Case number 2. John Fight. In the spring of 1960, the Rio Grande Valley was a place where a Catholic priest's word was absolute law. When 25-year-old schoolteacher and former beauty queen Irene Garza went to confession on Holy Saturday and never returned, the community was paralyzed. They couldn't imagine the truth. The man who took her life was the same man hearing her sins. John Bernard Fight was a 27-year-old visiting priest. On the evening of April 16th, Irene entered Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, Texas. Witnesses noted that Fight's confession line was moving unusually slowly and that he repeatedly left the sanctuary. We now know that Fight didn't use a traditional confession booth. He lured Irene into the church rectory, a private space that gave him the isolation he needed to attack. 5 days later, Irene's body was recovered from an irrigation canal. She had been beaten, raped while unconscious, and suffocated. Investigators draining the canal found church candlesticks and a Kodak slide viewer at the bottom. The viewer belonged to John Fight. He admitted it was his, but in 1960, his word was enough to deflect suspicion. Fight walked free for the next 57 years, not because of a lack of evidence, but because of a calculated institutional cover-up. 1960 was a critical election year, with John F. Kennedy running to be the first Catholic president. Church leadership and local officials feared a high-profile murder trial involving a priest would create a scandal that could tank Kennedy's campaign. A backroom deal was brokered. Catholic authorities and local law enforcement worked together to bury the investigation. This was later proven by the Palicki Letter, a smoking gun document where church officials detailed a plan to move Fight out of the state under the guise of normal obedience to hide him from the law. Irene wasn't his only victim. 3 weeks before her murder, Fight had attacked another woman, Maria America Guerra, in a nearby church. She fought him off, bit his finger, and later identified him in a police lineup. Even then, the system shielded him. He was allowed to plead no contest to a misdemeanor, paid a $500 fine, and was whisked away to a monastery. The church didn't just hide Fight, they promoted him. By the 1970s, Fight was in New Mexico serving as a superior at a facility for troubled priests. In an act of staggering negligence, a man who had already confessed his murder to fellow monks was now in charge of clearing other predatory priests for active ministry. One of the men Fight cleared was James Porter, who went on to abuse as many as 100 children. For decades, the case remained stagnant. A local district attorney, Renee Guerra, spent 30 years blocking the investigation and publicly mocking the evidence against Fight. It wasn't until a new district attorney was elected on the specific promise of justice for Irene that the case was finally reopened. In 2017, the silence of 60 years was broken. Former monks and reporters testified about Fight's decades-old confessions and the secret deals that had protected him. The jury saw past the collar, finding John Fight guilty of murder and sentencing him to life in prison. Fight died behind bars in 2020 at the age of 87. His story is a chilling study of institutional betrayal, a predator who used the ultimate authority of the priesthood to silence his victims and turn the legal system into his accomplice. Case number 3. David Russell Williams. For decades, David Russell Williams was the ultimate personification of Canadian institutional authority. He was a highly decorated colonel, the commander of Canada's largest airbase at CFB Trenton, and a trusted pilot for the world's most powerful leaders. He had flown Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, and multiple prime ministers. To the public, he was a hero and a rising star in the military hierarchy. To his subordinates, he was a disciplined, no-nonsense commander. But beneath the medals and the uniform, Williams was a man living a calculated, predatory double life. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a serial killer who used his position of power as a tactical shield. Williams' descent into darkness didn't begin with murder, it began with a secret, obsessive ritual that lasted for years. Between 2007 and 2010, while he was ascending to the highest echelons of military leadership, he committed at least 82 documented burglaries. He didn't steal money, electronics, or jewelry. Instead, he targeted the homes of girls and young women to steal their most intimate belongings, their undergarments. He was a meticulous archivist of his own deviance, a trait likely sharpened by his military training. Williams would break into a home, often while the occupants were sleeping or away, and meticulously arrange the stolen clothing on the victims' beds. He would then take photographs of the scene and, more disturbingly, photographs of himself wearing the stolen lingerie while standing in their private spaces. He kept a digital treasure trove of nearly 3,000 images, cataloged by date and location, tucked away on hidden hard drives in the ceiling of his basement. For years, he was known to the public only as the Tweed Creeper, a phantom that local police were powerless to catch. By late 2009, the burglaries were no longer enough to satisfy his escalating need for absolute control. He transitioned from a voyeuristic thief to a violent, sadistic predator. His first murder victim was Corporal Marie-France Como, a 37-year-old military flight attendant. This was the ultimate act of institutional betrayal. Como didn't just live in his community, she served under his direct command. Evidence later revealed that Williams used his authority as a wing commander to access confidential military files, obtaining her home address and her flight schedule to ensure she would be home alone. On the night of November 23rd, he broke into her home, struck her with a flashlight to subdue her, and subjected her to hours of ritualistic torture and rape, all of which he documented on video. Despite her desperate pleas for mercy, where she told him, "I've been a good person," Williams asphyxiated her with duct tape. In a display of inconceivable depravity, Williams stood in full uniform the very next day and signed a formal letter of condolence to the victim's father, playing the role of the grieving commander while the victim's blood was essentially still on his hands. The escalation continued in January 2010 with the abduction of 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd. He broke into her home at 1 a.m., kidnapped her, and transported her in his Nissan Pathfinder to his private cottage in Tweed. For 20 hours he held her captive, continuing his pattern of photographing his victims in states of distress before eventually strangling her. He disposed of her body in the woods, believing his status and his knowledge of forensic countermeasures made him untouchable. However, Williams' arrogance led to a fatal mistake. During the abduction of Jessica Lloyd, he left distinctive tire tracks in the fresh snow near her house. During a routine police canvass, an observant officer noticed that the tire treads on Williams' vehicle were a perfect match. This small forensic detail brought the high-ranking colonel into the crosshairs of the Ontario Provincial Police. On February 7, 2010, Williams was brought in for what he thought was a routine interview to clear his name. What followed is now studied globally as one of the most successful interrogations in history. Detective Sergeant Jim Smythe utilized a brilliant psychological strategy. He didn't treat Williams like a commander, he treated him like a suspect. He methodically removed the mask of authority, eventually dropping the title of colonel and addressing him simply as Russell. The breaking point came when Smythe placed a photo of a boot print from the crime scene next to a photo of the boots Williams was actually wearing in the interrogation room. Smythe told him directly, "These are identical. We both know you were at Jessica Lloyd's house." The psychological weight of the forensic evidence, combined with the realization that his hidden life was over, caused the colonel to buckle. He asked for a map and a pen, and he began to draw, marking the locations of the bodies and confessing to a 3-year spree of violence. The aftermath of his confession sent shockwaves through the nation. The Canadian Armed Forces took the unprecedented step of symbolically exorcising Williams. They didn't just discharge him, they stripped him of his rank, revoked his commission, and burned his uniforms and medals, in a move designed to erase him from military history. His office was gutted and rebuilt within days to remove any trace that he had ever commanded the base. Today, David Russell Williams is serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison with no chance of parole until 2035. He remains a terrifying case study in the organized serial killer, a man who was calm, technically proficient, and highly respected by day, but a sadistic monster by night. He proved that the most dangerous predators don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they are the ones leading the parade, wearing the medals, and saluting the flag.
Case number 4. Gilles de Rais. In the history of true crime, there is no fall from grace more steep or more terrifying than that of Gilles de Rais. In the year 1429, he was a national hero of France. He was the shadow and protector of Joan of Arc, a brilliant military commander who fought by her side to liberate the city of Orleans. At just 24 years old, he was appointed Marshal of France, the highest military honor in the kingdom. But beneath the polished armor of this premier aristocrat lived a predator whose crimes were so depraved that they eventually gave birth to the legend of Bluebeard. Gilles de Rais was born into unimaginable wealth and power. By the time he reached adulthood, he was one of the richest men in Europe, owning a vast empire of castles and lands across Brittany. However, after the execution of Joan of Arc in 1431, Gilles withdrew from the battlefield and retreated to his private estates. It was here, behind the thick stone walls of his fortresses at Machecoul and Champtocé, that he began a 10-year spree of abduction and murder that targeted the most vulnerable members of society, children. His method was systematic. Gilles used his status as a trusted authority to lure peasant children into his castles. His servants would approach children begging at the gates or looking for work, promising them positions as pages or singers in Gilles' private chapel. Once the portcullis dropped behind them, these children were never seen again. Inside, Gilles operated with absolute impunity. He was a sexual sadist who derived pleasure from the slow torture and mutilation of his victims. He would later confess to watching his victims die while he sat upon them, admiring their beauty in their final moments before engaging in necrophilia. As the years passed, Gilles' massive fortune began to evaporate, fueled by his obsession with staging grand theatrical spectacles and maintaining a private guard of 200 men. Desperate to restore his wealth, he turned to the occult. He hired alchemists and sorcerers, most notably a young Italian cleric named Francesco Prelati. Under Prelati's influence, Gilles began attempting to summon a demon named Baron to grant him gold. When the initial rituals failed, the sacrifices escalated. Gilles admitted to offering the demon the heart, hand, and eyes of a murdered child, believing that a blood sacrifice was the only way to satisfy the dark forces he sought to command. The disappearance of dozens, perhaps hundreds of children did not go unnoticed by the local peasantry, but in the 15th century, a peasant's word meant nothing against a marshal of France. Gilles' downfall only came when he overstepped his bounds and insulted a different kind of authority, the church. In 1440, during a heated property dispute, Gilles led an armed group into a church, kidnapped a clergyman in the middle of a service, and threw him into a dungeon. This act of sacrilege gave the Bishop of Nantes the legal opening he needed to investigate the dark rumors that had surrounded the Baron for years. The investigation was swift. As soon as the authorities began to look, the survivors and the families of the missing children came forward in droves. When Gilles was arrested, the sheer scale of the evidence broke his legendary arrogance. In his own castle at Champtissé, servants had previously been ordered to remove the skeletal remains of 40 children from a tower just to hide the evidence during a property sale. In October 1440, Gilles de Rais stood trial in both secular and church courts. Initially, he hurled insults at the judges, but when faced with the graphic testimony of his own valets and the threat of excommunication, he collapsed. He delivered a tearful confession that was so horrific the judges reportedly ordered parts of it to be stricken from the record to save the public from the details. He admitted to the systematic murder of children, blaming his behavior on a lack of discipline in his youth and his own unbridled idleness. On October 26, 1440, the hero of Orleans was led to a meadow in Nantes to be executed. In a final display of his aristocratic privilege, he was allowed to be hanged before his body was placed on a pyre, rather than being burned alive. Bizarrely, his final performance was one of deep religious contrition. He urged the crowd to raise their children in the fear of God and asked for forgiveness, a performance so convincing that for years after his death, he was actually remembered by some as a model of Christian penitence. Gilles de Rais is often cited as one of history's first documented serial killers. His story serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when absolute power meets absolute depravity. He was a man who stood at the right hand of a saint, only to use that prestige to hide the fact that he was the most dangerous monster of his age.
We've seen how these predators use the shields of the military, the church, and the crown to hide their darkest impulses. But as we move into the second half of this countdown, the cases get even closer to home, involving the very people sworn to protect your neighborhood and care for your family. We have 6 more cases to go, and the betrayal only gets deeper from here. If you're finding these deep dives into the mask of authority insightful, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the cases that institutions tried to bury. Drop a comment below. Which of these first 4 cases shocked you the most? Was it the police-turned-killer Anthony Sully in Case 1, or the marshal-turned-monster Gilles de Rais in Case 4? Let's discuss the psychology in the comments. Now, let's head to case number 5, where a badge didn't just protect a killer, it gave him the perfect tactical advantage. Case number 5. Joseph James DeAngelo. For over 40 years, the state of California was haunted by a phantom. He was known by a series of clinical titles: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker. He was a predator who seemed to have a supernatural ability to vanish into the night, bypassing police patrols and leaving seasoned investigators utterly baffled. In 2018, the world finally learned why he was so good at evading the law. He was a man who had been trained by the state to enforce it. Joseph James DeAngelo wasn't just a serial killer, he was a serving police officer during the height of his most terrifying crime sprees. DeAngelo's path to becoming the Golden State Killer was paved with a professional education in criminal justice. He earned a degree in police science and a bachelor's in criminal justice from California State University, Sacramento. He wasn't just guessing how to stay hidden. He knew exactly how forensic evidence was collected, how police perimeters were established, and how jurisdictional silos prevented different departments from sharing information. He used this specialized knowledge to turn the suburbs of California into his personal, tactical hunting grounds. His career as a predator began in the mid-1970s as the Visalia Ransacker. While serving as a burglary unit officer for the Exeter Police Department, DeAngelo committed over 100 home invasions. He was a fetishistic burglar who didn't care about money. He stole tokens like single earrings, blue chip stamps, and personal keepsakes. He would often rearrange the furniture or move window screens onto beds, marking the territory with ritualistic displays of dominance. His first murder occurred in 1975 when he shot and killed a local professor, Claude Snelling, who died while heroically stopping D'Angelo from kidnapping his teenage daughter. By 1976, D'Angelo moved to the Auburn Police Department and transformed into the East Area rapist. He began terrorizing the Sacramento suburbs, moving from attacking single women to targeting couples. He developed a signature, sadistic ritual that maximized psychological torture. He would tie up the male partner with shoelaces and place a stack of dishes or a perfume bottle on the man's back. He told them that if he heard the dishes rattle, he would kill everyone in the house. This forced the victims into a state of paralyzed, agonizing terror while he assaulted their partners for hours. He would even eat their food, drink their beer, and weep on their pillows, lingering in the homes as if he were an invited guest. During these attacks, he was often heard sobbing, "I hate you, Bonnie," a reference to a former fiancée who had rejected him years prior. The police shield that protected him finally cracked in 1979, not because of a murder investigation. D'Angelo was caught shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent, tools he frequently used to neutralize family pets during his home invasions. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department, but instead of stopping, he escalated to a lethal new phase. He moved to Southern California and became the original Night Stalker, transitioning from sexual assault to systematic execution. Between 1979 and 1986, he committed a series of brutal double homicides, often bludgeoning couples to death with heavy objects found on their own property, such as logs from their own fireplaces. For decades, the case went cold. D'Angelo settled into a seemingly mundane life as a truck mechanic for a grocery distribution center. He raised 3 daughters and faded into the anonymity of the suburbs, appearing to his neighbors as nothing more than a grumpy, highly strung old man who obsessed over his lawn. Because his DNA wasn't in any criminal database, he believed he was safe. He had no way of knowing that the science of the future was about to catch up with his past. In 2018, investigators utilized a revolutionary technique called investigative genetic genealogy. They took DNA from a 40-year-old crime scene and uploaded it to a public ancestry website. They didn't find D'Angelo's profile, but they found his distant 3rd and 4th cousins. By painstakingly rebuilding a massive, multi-generational family tree, they narrowed thousands of relatives down to one man living in Citrus Heights, Joseph James D'Angelo. On April 24, 2018, police waited for D'Angelo to take out his trash. They collected a tissue and a swab from his car door handle. The DNA was a 100% match. When they finally arrested him outside his home, the 72-year-old was so shocked that his mask of sanity finally slipped. He reportedly began to feign a mental breakdown, claiming a person inside him had forced him to do the things he did, a last-ditch effort to evade responsibility. In June 2020, to avoid the death penalty, D'Angelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. He also formally admitted to dozens of rapes that could no longer be prosecuted due to the statute of limitations. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Joseph James D'Angelo fundamentally changed the culture of California. He turned an era of open windows and community trust into one of deadbolts, alarm systems, and pervasive fear. His case stands as a landmark in forensic history, a reminder that while a badge can provide a temporary shield for a predator, the truth eventually leaves a genetic trail that time and technology will inevitably uncover.
Case number 6. Father Hans Schmidt. In the history of the American justice system, there are few figures as contradictory as Father Hans Schmidt. Executed in 1916, he holds a dark and singular distinction.
He is the first and only Catholic priest to be put to death by the state in the United States. Schmidt was a man of radical bifurcations, a consecrated priest who claimed to hear the voice of God, and a clinical predator whose fascination with biological destruction began in the slaughterhouses of his Bavarian youth. He used the ultimate mask of authority, the Roman collar, to hide a life of counterfeiting, fraud, and systematic murder. Schmidt's development followed a clear pathological trajectory. As a child in Germany, he was obsessed with the visceral reality of death. Despite being strictly forbidden by his parents, he visited local slaughterhouses daily, where he engaged in sexual activity while watching farm animals being killed. This psychological link between the sacred and the profane followed him into his adulthood and his ordination. Even after being suspended by the church in Germany for forging his academic credentials, Schmidt managed to flee to America. He navigated through Ellis Island by presenting fake papers to secure a position in the New York Archdiocese, proving how easily a high-functioning sociopath could exploit the institutional trust of the era. Before his arrival in New York, Schmidt's shadow loomed over a tragedy in Kentucky. While he was stationed at St. John's Parish in Louisville, an 8-year-old girl named Alma Kellner vanished from the church altar. Months later, her dismembered remains were found in the church basement. While a local janitor was eventually blamed, modern criminologists point to Schmidt as the likely perpetrator. The precision of the dismemberment in the Kellner case was a surgical signature that Schmidt would later perfect in his documented crimes. This period suggests that Schmidt wasn't just a murderer, but a seasoned serial predator who moved between parishes to stay one step ahead of the law. By 1910, Schmidt was in Manhattan, where his secret life became a complex web of deception. While serving as a respected assistant priest at St. Joseph's Church in Harlem, he was secretly living a double life. He maintained a clandestine sexual relationship with an Austrian immigrant named Anna Amuller, even going so far as to perform a secret marriage ceremony for himself and Anna in 1913. Simultaneously, he was running a sophisticated counterfeiting ring out of a secret dental office. Partnering with a fraudulent dentist named Dr. Ernest Murrett, Schmidt used professional copper plates and printing presses to produce high-quality $10 and $20 bills. This multifaceted deception, the fake priest, the fake husband, and the technical counterfeiter, created a psychological pressure cooker that was bound to explode. The collapse of this facade began when Anna became pregnant. Realizing that the birth of a child would lead to an investigation that would expose his fraudulent priesthood and his financial crimes, Schmidt decided to remove the threat. On the night of September 2, 1913, in a secret rented apartment on Broadhurst Avenue, Schmidt struck Anna unconscious and cut her throat. Using the anatomical knowledge he had gained from his childhood in the slaughterhouse, he dismembered her body with methodical precision. He divided her into 7 pieces, wrapped them in bundles of brown paper and newspaper, and weighted the bundles with stones before tossing them into the Hudson River midstream. In an act of extreme sociopathic audacity, Schmidt attempted to sanitize the crime scene by burning the blood-soaked mattress in a nearby vacant lot. He even enlisted the help of neighborhood children to gather firewood for the blaze, standing over the fire and watching as the physical evidence of his crime was consumed. He believed that the river in the fire had erased his sins, but he underestimated the rising power of forensic science. The investigation that followed was a milestone in policing. Led by Inspector Joseph Faureau, a visionary who had traveled to Scotland Yard to learn the science of fingerprinting, the NYPD utilized revolutionary trace evidence techniques. They didn't just look for a body, they looked at the materials used to wrap it. Faureau traced distinctive pillowcase tags and specific laundry marks found on the river bundles back to the rectory of St. Joseph's and then to the Broadhurst apartment. When Faureau raided the secret flat, he found a butcher's knife, a saw, ginger ale bottles used for pregnancy nausea, and bits of human bone in the bathroom drain. The evidence was undeniable.
When confronted, Schmidt initially tried to hide behind a divine excuse. He claimed that his patron saint, Elizabeth of Hungary, had appeared to him and commanded a blood sacrifice as atonement for his life of excess. He even admitted to drinking the victim's blood, a detail meant to bolster an insanity defense. During his trial, his lawyers argued the deific decree, the idea that he was acting under a holy delusion. However, the prosecution highlighted his cold premeditation, the rental of the secret apartment under a false name, the purchase of dismemberment tools, and the systematic disposal of the body. The case reached the highest levels of the American legal system. In a landmark ruling, Judge Benjamin Cardozo used the Schmidt case to redefine the legal meaning of wrong in the insanity defense. Cardozo argued that wrong must mean morally wrong in the eyes of the defendant, not just illegal. However, because Schmidt later admitted his insanity plea was a sham to avoid the chair, Cardozo denied him a new trial. He famously ruled that the justice system must not reward defendants for fraudulent post-trial tactics. On February 18, 1916, the man who had stood at the altar to offer the blood of Christ was led to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Hans Schmidt died as he lived, remarkably calm and manipulative to the end. His legacy remains a permanent stain on the history of the New York Archdiocese and a foundational case study in how a predator can use institutional trust to mask the most depraved impulses of the human mind.
Case number 7. Liu Pengli. While many of the world's most prolific serial killers operated in the shadows of the modern era, the earliest documented case of a recreational serial killer dates back over 2,000 years to the Western Han Dynasty of China. Liu Pengli was not a social outcast or a struggling laborer. He was the Prince of Jidong, a high-ranking member of the imperial Liu clan and a direct cousin to the legendary Emperor Wu. For 29 years, he turned his kingdom into a personal hunting ground, killing for what the royal records describe as sheer sport. Liu Pengli's rise to power was a byproduct of high-stakes imperial politics. Following the death of his father, the King of Liang, the central government partitioned the vast Liang territory among 5 sons. This was a strategic move by the emperor to prevent any single prince from becoming a military threat to the throne. Liu Pengli was granted the smaller, semi-autonomous kingdom of Jidong. This administrative maneuver gave a man described by ancient historians as uncouth and arrogant absolute local authority. With the imperial capital hundreds of miles away, there was virtually no oversight to check his escalating depravity, and he began to view his subjects not as people to be governed, but as prey. Unlike most serial killers who act as solitary shadows, Liu Pengli operated as a gang leader. He recruited a specialized cadre of 20 to 30 young men, consisting of household slaves and desperate fugitives hiding from the law. These men were often debtors or criminals who found a dark sanctuary in the prince's service. Under the cover of darkness, this marauding gang would venture out into the villages of Jidong. They didn't target political rivals or wealthy merchants for financial gain. Instead, they committed random robberies and cold-blooded murders of commoners and slaves alike. Sima Qian, the grand historian of China, emphasized that the primary objective was the act of killing itself, a perverse exercise of royal power that transformed the mandate of heaven into a mandate for murder. The scale of his crimes was staggering, even by modern standards. Over nearly 3 decades, Liu Pengli and his gang were responsible for over 100 confirmed murders. The social impact on the kingdom of Jidong was a state of total, agonizing paralysis. The local populace knew exactly who was responsible, but they were powerless against their sovereign. Families began to barricade themselves in their homes at sunset, effectively ceding the streets and the countryside to the prince's predatory whim. The kingdom became a place where the sun setting was a signal for the start of a hunt.
The reason Liu Pengli was able to operate for 29 years speaks to the deep-seated corruption and institutional shielding of the Han administrative system. While every kingdom was supposed to have an imperial chancellor and a tutor to monitor the prince's behavior, these officials were either intimidated into silence by the prince's armed gang or were deeply complicit in the crimes. The reign of terror only ended when the son of one of the victims, realizing that local justice was a lie, bypassed the entire regional hierarchy and sent a direct, desperate report to Emperor Wu in the capital of Chang'an. The imperial investigation that followed was swift and confirmed the horrific rumors. The court officials, adhering to the harsh legalist penal code of the time, requested the ultimate punishment, execution and the public exposure of the prince's head. However, the case ran into a foundational barrier of Chinese law, the 8 deliberations, or Ba Yi. This was a legal framework that provided institutional leniency for members of the imperial family and the elite. It suggested that those of high birth were subject to a different moral and legal standard than the common man. Emperor Wu famously stated that he could not bear to execute his own cousin, prioritizing the preservation of the imperial bloodline over the lives of over 100 commoners. Instead of death, Liu Pengli was sentenced to a civil death. He was stripped of his titles, demoted to the rank of a commoner, and banished to the remote frontier county of Shangyang, a rugged, mountainous region where he was forced to live among the very classes he had once hunted. His kingdom of Jidong was immediately abolished and absorbed into the direct control of the central government. Many historians believe that while the emperor spared his cousin's life out of family loyalty, he used the scandal as a convenient strategic excuse to dismantle a semi-autonomous kingdom and consolidate his own absolute power. Liu Pengli stands as a terrifying anomaly in ancient history, a man who proved that the most dangerous predators are often those who feel they are beyond the reach of any earthly law. His case remains a haunting commentary on the limits of justice in a system where royal blood provides a shield for the most depraved impulses. He was the first recorded thrill killer, a prince who treated the lives of his subjects as nothing more than pieces in a deadly 29-year game of sport.
Case number 8. Jane Toppen. While many serial killers are driven by a singular urge, money, revenge, or political gain, Jane Toppen, born Honora Kelly, was driven by a much darker, visceral compulsion. Operating at the turn of the 20th century, Toppen became one of America's most prolific serial killers, confessing to 31 murders while being suspected of over 100. She was a trained nurse who exploited the sacred trust of her profession to satisfy a lethal addiction. Watching the light leave a human being's eyes. Toppen's journey toward becoming the nightmare nurse began in the Irish slums of Boston. Born to an alcoholic father nicknamed Kelly the Crack, she was surrendered to a female asylum at age 6 and later indentured to the wealthy Toppen family of Lowell. This upbringing created a profound psychological rift. She was an outsider in a home where she was forced to suppress her Irish roots and even change her name. By the time she entered nursing school in 1883, she had developed a deceptive, cheerful mask known to colleagues and patients as Jolly Jane. Behind this mask, Toppen was an anatomist of death. During her training at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts General Hospital, she began conducting what she called scientific experiments on her patients. Her methodology was pharmacologically sophisticated and ruthlessly cruel. She would administer a dose of morphine to bring a patient to the brink of death, then use atropine, a stimulant derived from belladonna, to bring them back. She would cycle through this process multiple times, playing a godlike role at the threshold of existence. She later admitted that she derived a distinct sexual thrill from the process of her victims dying, even climbing into bed with them as they drifted into unconsciousness. The use of atropine wasn't just for her pleasure, it served a forensic purpose.
Morphine typically causes the pupils to constrict to pinpoints, a classic sign of overdose. Atropine, however, causes the pupils to dilate. By mixing the two, Toppin effectively masked the symptoms of her poisoning, allowing her to murder patients under the noses of doctors who attributed the deaths to natural causes, like heart failure or exhaustion. This level of pharmacological manipulation allowed her to kill for over a decade without a single official inquiry into her medical conduct. Toppin eventually transitioned into private duty nursing, where she had even less professional oversight. Her spree escalated from experimental clinical killings to murders motivated by personal vendettas in professional gain. In 1899, she murdered her foster sister, Elizabeth Toppin Brigham, out of decades of simmering jealousy. Toppin invited Elizabeth to a picnic, laced her water with strychnine, and watched with delight as the woman suffered the violent convulsions characteristic of the poison. Following the murder, Toppin even attempted to marry Elizabeth's widower, viewing herself as the rightful replacement in the household she had once served as a servant. The downfall of Jolly Jane finally came in 1901, following what became known as the Catamount Massacre. In just 40 days, Toppin decimated the Davis family, killing 4 members in rapid succession, including the elderly patriarch Alden Davis and his 2 daughters. Her arrogance was her undoing. The cluster of deaths was so suspicious that the husband of one victim, Captain Gibbs, demanded an investigation. Despite the initial belief among local doctors that the deaths were natural, Gibbs pushed for the exhumation of the bodies. Leonard Wood, the preeminent toxicologist in Massachusetts, performed the autopsies. His analysis confirmed lethal levels of morphine and, crucially, the presence of atropine. Combined with records showing Toppin had purchased these drugs under forged prescriptions, the evidence was undeniable. Toppin was arrested on October 29, 1901, and she showed no remorse, stating that she would have been a better woman if she had been married, but as she wasn't, she had to have some excitement. In a trial that captivated the nation, Toppin was examined by alienists, the 18th century term for psychiatrists. She was diagnosed with moral insanity, a condition where a person retains their intellectual faculties and can plan complex crimes, but possesses a total absence of moral sense or empathy. This was a precursor to the modern diagnosis of psychopathy. Toppin herself insisted she was sane, famously stating that her only ambition was to have killed more people than any other man or woman who ever lived. The jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity in just 27 minutes. Toppin spent the remaining 36 years of her life at the Taunton State Lunatic Hospital. In her later years, she became paranoid, believing the hospital staff was trying to poison her, a classic projection of her own lethal methodology. She would often refuse to eat unless she saw someone else taste the food first. Jane Toppin died in 1938 at the age of 84. She remains a seminal study in forensic psychiatry and the history of medicine, proving that the most dangerous predators are often those who can most effectively mimic the traits of the dedicated and the kind. She wasn't an angel of mercy. She was a predator who used the pharmacological tools of life to deliver the pleasure of death, leaving behind a legacy that forced the nursing profession to adopt stricter standards of vetting and oversight.
Case number 9. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov. The criminal history of Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov, known by the media as the werewolf and the Angarsk maniac, represents the most prolific spree of serial murder in the history of the Russian Federation. A former police sergeant and junior lieutenant, Popkov utilized his institutional authority, state-issued uniform, and patrol vehicle to execute a campaign of sexual violence and homicide that spanned 2 decades. While he has officially been convicted of 83 murders, his ongoing pattern of incremental confessions suggests a final victim count that could exceed 100, surpassing even notorious Soviet-era predators like Andrei Chikatilo and Alexander Pichushkin. Popkov's path to becoming a predator was inextricably linked to the socio-political collapse of the Soviet Union.
In the 1990s, the Siberian city of Angarsk was gripped by what investigators call criminal noise, a massive surge in regional mafia violence, gang wars, and contract killings that completely overwhelmed local law enforcement. In this environment of total administrative chaos, the disappearance or discovery of a woman's body in the remote taiga or a local cemetery was often dismissed as a peripheral consequence of general lawlessness. Popkov thrived in this oversight. As a serving officer, he was not only aware of police procedures, he frequently attended his own crime scenes in an official capacity as a responding officer. This allowed him to monitor the investigation's progress from the inside and ensure no forensic links were ever established to his personal life. Popkov's psychological profile was built on a twisted, cleaner narrative. He claimed to be a moral arbiter of the streets, targeting women who were intoxicated or out late without male chaperones, asserting that he was purging society of immoral elements. However, his victimology revealed a broader, more sadistic truth that had nothing to do with morality. His victims included ordinary mothers, students, and even a fellow police officer, a male colleague he killed in 1899 after offering him a ride, proving his homicidal urges were not strictly limited to his moral cleansing ideology. His methodology, dubbed the Wednesday murderer because victims were often discovered mid-week, involved the police trap. He would offer late-night rides to women while he was either in full uniform or driving his official patrol car. By exploiting the public's inherent and historical trust in the police, he neutralized his victims' survival instincts before driving them to secluded forests or the Novo-Leninsky Cemetery to be executed with an array of household tools, including hammers, axes, screwdrivers, and knives. For 20 years, Popkov successfully eluded capture, despite the fact that investigators had found tire tracks from a Lada 4x4, a ubiquitous police vehicle, at multiple crime scenes. The forensic breakthrough finally arrived in 2012, long after Popkov had retired from the force to work as a security guard. A specialized cold case unit re-examined evidence from the mid-1990s and managed to isolate a viable DNA sample from a victim. This led to one of the largest genetic screening programs in criminal history. The investigative team did not just test the public, they initiated a massive DNA sweep of 3,500 current and former police officers in the Irkutsk region who fit the profile of owning or operating a Lada. Popkov was finally identified when his DNA provided a 100% match to the profile recovered from the decades-old evidence. He was apprehended in Vladivostok on June 23, 2012, while he was in the middle of a trip to purchase a new car. Since his initial arrest, Popkov has turned the Russian judicial system into a stage for a slow, calculated reveal. He was first sentenced to life in 2015 for 22 murders, followed by a second life sentence in 2018 for an additional 56 killings. During the 2018 trial, the court took the unprecedented step of stripping him of his rank and his police pension, a move that reportedly upset Popkov more than the life sentence itself. His confessions have continued into the mid-2020s, with his most recent conviction occurring in November 2023 for 3 more murders committed between 1997 and 2003. Criminologists believe these staggered, incremental confessions are a deliberate tactical maneuver to improve his quality of life. Each new investigation requires him to be transferred from the Black Dolphin Prison, a facility on the Kazakhstan border known for its legendary and brutal high-security regime, to more lenient pre-trial detention centers for months at a time. For Popkov, remembering a new victim is essentially a way to buy a temporary reprieve from total isolation. The Werewolf of Angarsk remains a definitive study in the dangers of unmonitored institutional power. He proved that the most effective predators are often those who operate from within the very systems designed to stop them, using the tools of the state to hide the bodies of the citizens they swore to protect. His case has forced a total reevaluation of psychological vetting procedures within the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs and remains an active, evolving record of one of the darkest chapters in modern forensic history. Even now, investigators believe there are more victims whose stories remain buried in the Siberian permafrost, waiting for Popkov to use them as his next piece of judicial leverage.
Case number 10. Jeffrey Lundgren. The case of Jeffrey Lundgren and the 1989 Kirtland cult murders serves as a definitive study in how charismatic authority can be weaponized within a splintered religious framework. Lundgren, a self-proclaimed prophet and former lay minister of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, RLDS, orchestrated the systematic ritual execution of the Avery family, a family of 5, including 3 young children, as a perceived spiritual necessity. This report explores the theological radicalization, the chiastic manipulation of Scripture, and the precise mechanical execution of the crimes that eventually led to the first use of lethal injection in Ohio's modern history. Jeffrey Lundgren's path to violence began in the mid-1980s when he was appointed as a senior guide at the historic Kirtland Temple in Ohio. Leveraging the site's immense spiritual gravity, Lundgren cultivated a group of followers from the conservative fringes of the RLDS Church, which was then undergoing a period of liberal reform. He presented himself as a restorer of lost truths, using a complex method of scriptural interpretation known as chiasmus. While chiasmus is a recognized literary structure in ancient texts, where ideas repeat in reverse order, such as A, B, B, A, Lundgren contorted it into a mystical decoding tool. He claimed he could divide the word to extract direct divine commands that eventually called for blood atonement. This was a distorted revival of an abandoned 19th-century doctrine, which Lundgren used to argue that the only way for his followers to see God was through the literal shedding of those he deemed dross, or unfaithful. The social structure of the Lundgren cult was designed for totalistic isolation and psychological dependency. After his excommunication in 1988, Lundgren moved his core followers into a rented farmhouse on Chardon Road. He implemented a strict ban on murmuring, any private conversation between followers that he did not personally oversee or approve. He demanded absolute financial surrender, forcing members to hand over their entire paychecks and savings to him. He convinced his followers that they were a paramilitary unit, destined to seize the Kirtland Temple by force to prepare for the second coming of Christ, which he predicted would occur on his own birthday, May 3rd. To prepare for this ascent, the group spent months conducting military drills in the woods, using semi-automatic weapons and tactical gear, and practicing dry runs of the temple takeover. The primary targets of his first cleansing were Dennis and Cheryl Avery and their 3 daughters, Trina, 15, Rebecca, 13, and Karen, 7. Despite the Averys' extreme devotion, Dennis had sold his family home in Missouri and given the $40,000 proceeds directly to Lundgren. Jeffrey viewed them with growing contempt. He specifically targeted Dennis Avery for sinning by keeping a small private bank account for family emergencies, which Jeffrey characterized as a lack of faith in the prophet. In his contorted theology, the Averys were weak branches that needed to be pruned from the vineyard. He began referring to the family as the sacrifices needed to redeem the land before the group could enter the temple. The murders on April 17, 1989, were planned and executed with chilling precision. Lundgren ordered his followers to dig a 6-by-7-foot pit in the dirt floor of the farm's barn days in advance. On the night of the killings, Lundgren hosted a Last Supper at a local motel where he fed his followers a final meal before asking each man individually if they were with him in the sacrifice. The victims were then lured to the barn one by one under the guise of performing a chore. Dennis Avery was the first. Once inside, he was bound with silver duct tape, gagged, and thrown into the pit. Lundgren then shot him twice in the back with a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The process was repeated for his wife and 3 daughters. To drown out the sound of the gunfire and the possible screams, followers ran a chainsaw and a tractor outside the barn, while the women back in the farmhouse remained inside cleaning up after dinner to maintain a facade of normalcy.
The group successfully fled the state the very next day, remaining at large for nearly 9 months in the mountains of West Virginia and later Missouri. The bodies were only discovered in January 1990 after a disgruntled follower, Keith Johnson, whose wife had been taken by Lundgren as a spiritual spouse, provided a tip to federal authorities. When investigators finally excavated the barn floor, they found the 5 bodies stacked in the pit, still bound in duct tape. Ballistics experts were able to match the rifling marks on the recovered bullets to the .45 caliber pistol found in Lundgren's possession upon his arrest in San Diego. During his 1990 trial, Lundgren remained entirely unrepentant, asserting his prophetic status even as he was sentenced to death. His psychological evaluations noted his narcissism and paranoia, but he was found legally sane because he clearly understood the wrongfulness of his actions, as evidenced by his efforts to hide the bodies, fabricate letters to the victims' families, and flee across state lines. His execution on October 24, 2006, followed a protracted legal battle where his attorneys argued his obesity and diabetes would make lethal injection cruel and unusual. He died expressing love for his family and for a spiritual wife, but showing absolutely no remorse for the children he had executed in the barn.
The cases we've explored today are more than just a list of crimes. They are a sobering reminder of the mask of sanity. Whether it was a badge, a collar, or a crown, these individuals utilized the highest forms of institutional trust to hide the lowest forms of human depravity. They remind us that the most dangerous predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're the ones we've been taught to look up to. As we close these files, remember that justice, while sometimes delayed for decades or even centuries, has a way of catching up. From the genetic trail left by the Golden State Killer to the smoking gun letters that expose decades of cover-ups, the truth eventually demands to be heard. If you found these deep dives into the dark side of authority insightful, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new case file. Every sub helps us keep uncovering these stories. Before we go, I want to give a special thank you to our community. A huge shout out to Justin from the US. We're so glad you're enjoying the documentaries. And a big shout out to Linman from the UK. Thank you for tuning in from across the pond. If you want to shout out in our next case, make sure to leave a comment below and let us know where you are watching from. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and stay safe. I'll see you in the next one.